My husband received a call in the middle of the night, and his reaction made me follow him. I was never the type of woman who goes through her husband's phone. Never. Not because I was naive, but because I believed, with every fiber of my being, that what we had was different. That what Nathan and I had built over 12 years of marriage was the kind of thing that doesn't break. You know how it is. You meet someone, you fall in love slowly, the right way, and after a while you stop questioning because the answer has always been the same. This man is your home. I thought I knew by heart the way he breathed while he slept, the smell of his neck after a shower, the exact sound he made when he was worried, that low sigh, almost a whistle, that slipped between his lips before he even noticed. I knew Nathan like the back of my own hand, or at least that's what I believed for 12 years. It was on a Tuesday in November that everything began to fall apart. Not all at once, not with an explosion or a dramatic confrontation. It started with a sound, a simple screen glow in the dark, and a vibration just strong enough to pull me out of the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. It was 2:17 in the morning. I saw the time out of the corner of my eye as I tried to understand what had woken me. Nathan was lying beside me, completely still, and for a moment, I thought I had dreamed it. But then his screen lit up again, vibrated again, and this time I saw it, even if only for half a second, the light reflected on the white ceiling of our bedroom. Someone was calling my husband at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. What made me stop was him, Nathan, because what happened next was the strangest thing I had ever seen in 12 years of sleeping beside that man. He didn't move. Let me explain what that means. Nathan is a light sleeper, always has been. He wakes up at the sound of the neighbor closing their car door outside. He wakes up when I roll over. Once he woke up because I was dreaming too loudly, according to him. But that night, with his phone vibrating practically under his pillow, my husband didn't move, didn't twitch, didn't breathe differently. Nothing. And there, in that specific moment, as the room went dark again and I pretended I was still asleep, something inside me changed. Like a switch being pressed in a room I didn't know existed. It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't even suspicion, not the way people describe it. It was a cold, almost clinical feeling. The feeling that something was wrong and that I needed to pay attention. I closed my eyes, stayed quiet, and decided to wait. For the next 3 days, nothing. Nathan went to work at his usual time, came home at his usual time, had dinner with me, asked about my day, watched the series we were binging together, went to sleep. Everything normal, everything exactly as it had always been. And it was precisely that which started to bother me, the perfection. Because when we're hiding something, we tend to try a little harder than necessary. And Nathan was trying, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but he was. He asked how I was doing with a slightly higher frequency than usual. He touched my shoulder when he passed through the kitchen. He smiled at me before falling asleep as if he were memorizing my face. Have you ever experienced that? That moment when someone's kindness starts to frighten you more than any coldness ever could? On Friday evening, after a quiet dinner in which Nathan opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for special occasions, with no special occasion in sight, I finally asked. Casual, almost distracted, as if it were a random memory. I got a strange call last week in the middle of the night, I said, looking at my glass. I thought it came from your phone, but it could have been mine. Have you received any weird calls lately? Nathan took a sip of wine, paused for half a second that felt like an eternity in my head, and then shrugged. Not that I remember. Why, did it come from an unknown number? Could be, I said. Forget it. And he forgot. With a disturbing ease, he simply changed the subject and started talking about a coworker. And I sat there, smiling at the right moments, responding during the right pauses, while a part of me grew more and more awake, more and more alert. It was the following Sunday that I found the piece of paper. I was looking for the spare car key. Nathan had used it the week before when my battery died and we had swapped for a day. I went to the inner pocket of his jacket, that old gray jacket he wears when it's cold outside, and my hand found something beyond the key. A piece of paper folded 3 times, small, the size of a Post-it note. I should have put it back. A part of me knew that, but my hand had already opened it before my brain gave the order. It was an address. Just that. An address written by hand, Nathan's handwriting, unmistakable, that's 7, with the crossbar through the middle that he learned while living a year in Europe when he was younger. And below it, a time. Thursday, 9 p.m. Thursday was 4 days away. I put the paper back in the pocket, put the key in my bag, left the room as if nothing had happened, and spent the next 4 days being the best version of myself I had ever been. Present, affectionate, calm. While inside I built one theory after another and knocked each one down before it went too far. Because the truth is, I didn't know what I was looking for. Didn't know if I wanted to find anything. But I knew that Thursday night I was going to be at that address. On Thursday afternoon I told Nathan I was going to see a friend, that I'd probably be home late. He said, "Great, enjoy yourself, love you." I said love you back and walked out the door feeling like something was being torn inside me. But quietly, like fine fabric that gives way stitch by stitch before you realize you're in 2 pieces. The address was in a neighborhood I know, but don't frequent. A semi-industrial area that had become semi-cultural in recent years, one of those places with renovated warehouses and restaurants with minimalist names. I arrived 40 minutes early. I parked 2 blocks away and walked, with my hood up, feeling completely ridiculous and completely unable to turn back. The address corresponded to a warehouse. High windows, a black-painted iron door, no visible signage. There were 3 cars parked out front. None of them were Nathan's. I stood on the opposite side of the street, leaning against a wall, staring at the door as if it would give me an answer. At 8:51 p.m., Nathan's car turned the corner. My heart did something I don't know how to describe. It didn't race, it grew heavy, as if it had sunk a few centimeters inside my chest, and suddenly there was less air around it. He parked, got out of the car. He was wearing casual clothes, dark pants, that blue shirt I have an absurd fondness for because he wore it on our second date, and walked straight to the iron door with the confidence of someone who had done this before. He didn't look around, didn't hesitate. He pressed a buzzer I hadn't noticed and waited. The door opened, and a woman came out. She must have been around 40, dark hair pinned up haphazardly, an expression I couldn't read from that distance. She and Nathan stood in the doorway for maybe 30 seconds. She spoke. He listened. And then she put her hand on his arm. Not in an intimate way. I noted that with an absurd precision, but in an urgent way, like someone holding on to a person who might fall. And the 2 of them went inside. The door closed. I stood outside for almost 10 minutes without being able to move. The wind was cold. I hadn't brought gloves. My mind was doing that thing it does when it's overloaded, stopping completely. A white, deafening silence where thoughts should have been. And then something shifted in my decision-making. It wasn't courage, it was curiosity, the kind that hurts. I crossed the street, walked to the door, pressed the buzzer. It took about 15 seconds. The door opened, the same woman, and I saw her expression change when she looked at me. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition, as if she knew who I was. "You're Claire," she said. It wasn't a question. I said yes without knowing why, because up to that moment I hadn't planned to get this far. And she opened the door wider and said, "Come in then," in a tone that was neither hostile nor friendly. It was simply inevitable, as if my arrival there were part of some script I hadn't read, but that everyone around me already knew. The interior of the warehouse was different from what I'd expected. It wasn't empty or frightening. It was lit, with tables, chairs, a few people moving around with the tired expression of those in the middle of something long and important. It looked like an improvised office, or perhaps an operations room for something I didn't know how to name. Nathan had his back to me, talking with an older man I had never seen. And then he turned around. The moment he saw me was the longest of my life. It wasn't the expression of a man caught. There was no guilt there. Not the kind I'd expected. What I saw on Nathan's face was something that broke me in a different, more complicated way. Relief. A tremendous relief, almost painful, like that of someone who has carried something too heavy for too long and can finally set it down. He came toward me, took my hands, and said, "I needed to tell you. I know I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry. My name is Claire Hartley. I am 42 years old. I have been married to Nathan Hartley for 12 years and dated him for 2 before that. We have an apartment that got small when the cats arrived, a ridiculous collection of cookbooks that neither of us actually uses, and a tacit agreement that Saturday morning is sacred. Black coffee, the print newspaper, no phones at the table. And on that Thursday in November when I walked into that warehouse, I discovered that the man I thought I knew completely had been keeping a secret that dated back to before he met me. It wasn't a betrayal. It was something more complicated than that. Nathan had a brother, not a brother of the heart, not a distant half-brother who occasionally shows up on social media. A blood brother, Oliver, 2 years younger, with whom he had cut contact almost 15 years ago for reasons he had never told me, because he had never told me Oliver existed. The woman who had opened the door, Diane, I was introduced to her with my head spinning, was Oliver's wife. And Oliver, the brother who didn't exist, was dying. Cancer. Pancreatic. Stage 4. Discovered too late, as tends to happen with that particular kind of silence the body sometimes keeps until it can no longer. The call in the middle of the night had been Diane, calling to say that Oliver had asked to see Nathan one last time, that the doctors were giving him weeks, not months, that there were things unsaid that needed to be said before the window closed. And Nathan, my Nathan, who sleeps lightly and always wakes at any sound, had lain completely still that night because the call had paralyzed him in a way I had never seen. Because hearing the name of the brother he had emotionally buried 15 years ago was the only sound in the world capable of doing that to him. He hadn't told me because he didn't know how. Because Oliver's story was the story of one of the darkest periods of Nathan's life, a time he had chosen not to carry into our marriage, not out of lack of trust in me, but out of a kind of retroactive shame. The shame of having been the type of person who cuts ties, who abandons, who chooses silence as a permanent solution. We sat at a table at the back of that warehouse, which was, I later discovered, a space Diane rented for small business meetings as she ran a consultancy. And Nathan told me everything. In chronological order, without sparing the hard parts, his voice steady in the way of someone finally saying something that had been stuck in their throat for too long. The story of Nathan and Oliver was the story of 2 sons of a family that came apart slowly. Their father, Gerald, had a problem with drinking that took years to be recognized as a problem, and more years still to be addressed, and along the way destroyed things that don't rebuild easily: trust, safety, the belief that the adults around you are safe. Their mother, Ruth, did what many mothers do in those situations. She stayed, tried to keep everything standing for too long. And the 2 sons responded in opposite ways, as siblings often do when the ground disappears beneath their feet. Nathan left. At 19, with a backpack and a specific amount of anger channeled toward his own survival, he left for the city and never looked back. He built the life you know: college, career, stability, me. Rebuilt himself brick by brick with the determination of someone fleeing a fire who keeps running even after the flames have been left behind. Oliver stayed. Oliver stayed with their parents, absorbed what Nathan had rejected, became the vessel for everything Nathan had refused to be. And for years, Nathan knew this, knew his brother was there, knew the situation was difficult, and chose distance, because distance was the only way he knew to keep himself whole. The final break came 15 years ago, when Oliver called asking for money. Nathan sent the money. The money wasn't the problem. But along with the transfer, he sent a message that, in his own words, should never have been sent. Words of accumulation, years of the unspoken, words that come out with the destructive logic of someone who finally opens a valve that has been shut for too long. Oliver responded. Nathan responded. And then there was a silence that lasted 15 years. As he spoke, I kept looking at the hands I was holding, hands I knew by heart. Nails always a little too short because he has the habit of biting them when he's concentrating. The simple gold wedding band we chose together at a small jewelry shop because neither of us wanted anything showy. And I thought, how much of a person fits into the spaces you don't occupy? How much can exist in the silences you never thought to fill because you assumed there was nothing there? Diane brought us coffee. She was a woman of few words but great presence, one of those people who doesn't need to say much for you to feel they are completely there. She must have loved Oliver with a depth that made me feel immediately that he was someone worth loving. "He wants to see you," she said to Nathan. "He won't ask again." Nathan looked at me, and there, in that moment, something happened that I wasn't expecting. He waited for my response. Not like asking for permission, Nathan isn't that kind of man, but more like participation. As if, by finally bringing me inside that secret, he was asking me to be part of the solution as well. I said, "Shall we go together?" He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was an expression I had never seen on him. Not exactly relief, more than that. Something resembling being seen, completely seen, including the parts that aren't beautiful. "If you want to," he said, "I want to." Oliver was in an apartment 20 minutes away, on a high floor of a modern building overlooking the river. Diane had mentioned they had bought the apartment when everything still seemed possible, when the diagnosis was still uncertain and plans were being made with the serene arrogance of those who don't yet know. There were flowers in the windows, a collection of vinyl records visible through the living room, an elderly dog who barely lifted its head when we came in. Oliver was on the sofa, covered with a thick blanket, even with the heater on. He looked like Nathan in a way that hit me physically. The same eyes, the same jawline, but as if someone had taken my husband's mold and filled it with different material, more translucent, as if the light passed through differently. He was thin in a way his clothes couldn't hide, but there was a quality in his eyes that I can only describe as presence. He was there, completely there, more there than many people I know who are in perfect health. Nathan stood in the entrance to the living room for a moment that wasn't quite hesitation. It was the pause of someone preparing for the weight of what they were about to do. Oliver spoke first. "You've gotten old," he said, and Nathan laughed. That short, involuntary laugh that comes out when emotion doesn't know what shape to take, and said, "So have you." I didn't introduce myself right away. I stayed back, near the wall, giving space to that moment that wasn't mine. Diane came to sit beside me without my having to ask, and the two of us sat as witnesses to something that had begun long before our presence in those lives. The two brothers talked for hours. I moved in and out of the room, helped Diane make tea, played a little with the dog who eventually perked up, stood on the terrace looking at the lights on the river, thinking about everything and nothing. Sometimes, from the conversations inside, fragments would reach me, a name from the past, a date, a laugh followed by silence. Sometimes, long stretches of silence. Around midnight, Nathan appeared on the terrace. He stood beside me, said nothing for a few minutes. "He apologized to me," Nathan said finally. I didn't ask for what. Sometimes the question matters less than the fact itself. "I apologize too," he said. More silence, the river glittering below. "Are you angry with me?" he asked. I thought through the answer honestly before giving it. because the question deserved that. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm sad. There's a difference." "Sad why?" "Because you carried this alone for 12 years, and I could have carried it with you." He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. And then he put his arm around my shoulders, that specific movement of his, which starts at the elbow before reaching the shoulders, which I had learned to love before I even knew it was a habit, and said, "I didn't know you'd want to, didn't know you'd—" And there, on that cold November terrace, looking at the river glittering indifferently below, I understood something about marriage that no book had ever taught me, and no conversation had come close to describing. That intimacy isn't only what you share, it's also what you stop hiding. That knowing someone completely isn't an achievement you arrive at. It's an ongoing practice, full of revisions, of layers that only appear when the situation is large enough to demand it. I didn't know Nathan completely. I never had. And strangely, realizing that on that night didn't push me away from him. It drew me closer in a way that 12 years of happy, everyday life together had never quite managed. We spent another 2 hours with Oliver and Diane before leaving. Before we went, I introduced myself properly, not as Nathan's wife, but as myself, Claire, who worked in graphic design and read science fiction and got annoyed when her coffee went cold. And Oliver looked at me with those translucent eyes and said, "I had been waiting to meet you. Nate used to talk about you in the few times we spoke over the years." I looked at Nathan. He had his eyes on the floor. "He would call me sometimes," Oliver said quietly. "Never for long. But he would call. He just didn't know how to continue." In the car on the way home, we were silent for a long time. A different silence than usual, denser, fuller, the kind of silence that only exists after something important. "Why didn't you tell me?" I finally asked, not as an accusation. With genuine curiosity, the same curiosity that had made me cross the street and press that buzzer. Nathan drove for another block before answering. "Because I was ashamed," he said, "not of Oliver, of myself, of what I did, of what I didn't do, of how I treated someone who was my blood as if I could just cancel them, as if family were a subscription you can cancel when it becomes inconvenient." A pause. "I was afraid that if you knew, you'd see me differently." Differently how? As someone capable of abandoning. I got home that night and went straight to the bathroom. I stood under the hot shower for about 10 minutes without doing anything, just letting the water fall, trying to organize everything that had happened into some sequence that would fit inside me. I couldn't. Some nights are too large to fit into a night. Nathan was in bed when I came out, but not sleeping. He was on his back, looking at the ceiling, with that expression I now identified differently. Not insomnia, not worry, but the face of someone processing too much at once. I lay down beside him. We lay there looking at the ceiling together. "How much time does he have?" I asked. Diane said the doctors are talking in terms of weeks. Could be a month, could be less. "Will you see him again?" "Yes," without hesitation. "Then I will too." He turned his head to look at me. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." We lay there for a moment and then he said, "You know what's most absurd? For all these years, every time I thought about telling you about Oliver, the first thing that came to mind was the risk of you judging me. And the first thing you did when you found out was say you'd come with me." 12 years, I said, "and you still haven't learned that I'm not good at judging?" He laughed, for real this time. A laugh that had a little crying inside it, the kind that only comes out when the pressure underneath finally finds release. In the weeks that followed, Nathan visited Oliver 4 times. I went with him on 3. In the hours we spent in that apartment overlooking the river, I learned things about the man I married that I could never have learned any other way. I saw him talk about his father with an honesty that had clearly taken decades to build. I saw him and Oliver have a real argument one afternoon, an old sibling fight, full of references I didn't understand but could feel the weight of, and then make up with the awkward ease of those who have discovered that the hurt was great, but the love was greater. I saw Nathan cry, not the discreet, controlled crying he sometimes lets slip during films. Real crying, messy, the kind you can't hold back, which came one afternoon when Oliver had a pain crisis and Nathan stood there holding his brother's hand while Diane waited for the nurse to arrive, and I stayed near the window, witnessing a love that had almost never existed because of years of silence. Oliver died on a morning in December, with Diane by his side and with his last conversation with Nathan having taken place 2 days before. A 40-minute video call in which the two of them spent much of the time nearly silent on screen, simply existing together through the glass. The funeral was small. Diane had family, a few close friends, co-workers. Nathan went. We went. And it was the first time he had been in a space associated with his family of origin, without that alertness in his posture that I only identified as a posture because I finally had the context to recognize it. Ruth came, their mother, a small woman with white hair whom I recognized immediately by the resemblance in her eyes. The same eyes as Nathan, the same as Oliver's, that specific brown with a darker spot near the iris. She and Nathan looked at each other from a distance for a while, and then she walked toward him, slowly, with the caution of someone who knows they are approaching something that might pull away, and said his name. Just his name. And he said hers. And they stood there in front of each other, not yet embracing, simply existing in the same space after years of not doing so. I stepped back. Didn't leave, but gave space. That kind of space that isn't absence, it's presence at a distance, the kind that says, I'm here, but this moment is yours. The hug, when it came, was quick and awkward, like two people who don't yet know how to do this right, but know they need to try. And it was enough. For now, it was enough. In the car afterward, Nathan said nothing for a long time. I drove. He looked out the window. Did you know I needed to see her? He finally asked. I imagined. How? Because you're the kind of person who will need a second chance to do the right thing. Not because you're weak, because you're human. He was quiet for a little longer. You see me much better than I deserve. No, I said. I see you the right way. There's a difference. January arrived with the warming of the northern hemisphere summer and with a different lightness inside the house. Not the manufactured lightness of before, when the air had been too clean because Nathan had been trying too hard. A real lightness, the kind that comes when something heavy has finally been set down. He slept differently, talked differently. There were fewer pauses before answers, less of that fractional hesitation I had learned to notice without knowing its name. One evening, as we made that Friday dinner that was our ritual, he cooked, I opened the wine, we argued about something irrelevant in some show we were watching. He stopped in the middle of chopping carrots and said, There are more things I haven't told you. I stopped opening the bottle. Not big things like Oliver, he continued, without looking at me. But there are parts of before that I needed to rebuild, that I never brought up because I don't quite know how. I went to him, took the knife from his hand and set it on the counter, leaned against the counter beside him so that we were facing each other. You can tell me, I said. It doesn't have to be all at once. It can be slowly. But you can tell me. He looked at me for a moment with that expression I now knew how to name, and said, Did you know I was going to say this? I knew you were going to need to, I said. That's different. We stayed in the kitchen until midnight. The carrots sat in pieces on the chopping board. Dinner was improvised with what we had and turned out wonderful in the way improvised dinners sometimes do. And Nathan talked, not all at once, he was right about that, but enough for me to begin to understand the contours of a story I had only known from the middle onward. There's something nobody tells you about discovering a secret your partner has been keeping. that the hardest part isn't the secret itself. It's the moment after, when you have to decide what to do with what you know. When you have to ask yourself, did this secret change what I feel? Did it change who I think this person is? Or did it simply give me one more piece of a puzzle that was incomplete? For me, it was the third. It was a missing piece that, when fitted in, didn't deform the image. It deepened it, added relief where there had been flatness, added shadow where there had been only light, and the shadow made everything more real, more three-dimensional, more true. 12 years is a long time to know someone. But also, and I learned this in that strange full November, 12 years is the beginning of understanding that knowing someone completely is not a destination. It's a journey that continues as long as both people are willing to keep asking questions. As long as one can say there are more things and the other can say, you can tell me. March now. The wine Nathan opened without a special occasion that evening before everything happened. I understand now why he did. He was, in his tortured and silent way, trying to create a moment of openness he didn't know how to create with words, trying to say something he didn't yet know how to say. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and lie watching him sleep. Not with anxiety, without any anxiety at all, just with that kind of renewed attention that we sometimes lose in the routine of daily life and sometimes, if we're lucky, recover. Watching the way he breathes, which I now know is light because that's how he's always been, but sometimes, only sometimes, he pretends to a deeper sleep than he's in because he's thinking about something he's not yet ready to say. And when that happens, I lie quietly beside him and let time do its work. Because I know now, know it in a way I didn't before November, before that call at 2:17 a.m., before I crossed the street and pressed a buzzer I shouldn't have pressed, that the truth always comes, not always in the form you imagine, not always at the moment you would choose, but it comes. And what you do with it when it arrives is what defines everything. Diane is still part of our lives. We see each other once a month, sometimes more. She's doing well. That's relative when you're talking about grief. But she's on her feet, she's working, she's living the way Oliver would have wanted her to live, which is with presence and without hiding. Sometimes she brings photos. Sometimes we talk about Oliver without it hurting so much, and sometimes it hurts a great deal, and both ways are fine. Ruth called Nathan in February. A short call, 15 minutes, in which most of the time was spent on small things, weather, health, a neighbor of theirs who had caused some trouble. But it was a call. And there will be another, that much we know. And Nathan? Nathan is the same person he has always been, with the difference that I now know him a little more whole. He still wakes at any sound, except, as I discovered, when the sound is the kind he chose, for one night, not to hear. He still makes that low sigh when he's worried, still bites his nails too short when he's concentrating, still being my home, which is what he always was, only now with more rooms mapped. That piece of paper in his jacket pocket, those folds of someone who writes down an address and puts it in their pocket without yet knowing what they'll do with it. Those folds were Nathan's attempt to begin finding his way back to a part of himself he had left behind. And I, without knowing that, followed him there. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you made it here, you know that this is not a story about betrayal. It's about how what goes unsaid can weigh just as heavily as what is done, and about how sometimes the most courageous act in a marriage is not confronting the other person, but finally showing yourself to them whole. If you recognized yourself in any part of this, whether in Nathan's silence, in Claire's anxious waiting, in the middle of the night call that changes everything, leave a comment telling me. I want to know what moved you. And if you think someone you know needs to hear this, send it to them. Sometimes the right story arrives at the right time, like this video if the story landed in the right place. And subscribe to the channel, because every week we bring more stories like this, real, human, unfiltered, and without easy endings. Just the truth the way it is, messy, full of silences, and more beautiful than it looks from a distance. See you in the next video.